Hey there, internet friends. Welcome to another episode of That Nerdy Site Show, a weekly podcast where the team members from That Nerdy Site get together to talk about our lives and all of the nerdy things we love about them. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and joining me this week we have Logan Wilkinson back on the show. How you doing, Logan?
I'm doing good. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. We sat down, we chatted, for a good 30 minutes about Star Wars
Hmm.
hopping in and
Fun.
sitting down and recording this. So fired up and ready to go, ready to talk non-Star Wars, but also a little bit of Star Wars stuff. Today we are going to be
Ooh, Star
talking
Wars.
about Logan has sat down and watched Raya and the Last Dragon and Annihilation, so he will have some film thoughts on that. I sat down and rewatched Raya and the Last Dragon in anticipation of that last night, so this will probably be largely a conversation about Raya and the Last Dragon, I imagine. But then also, Logan has just started playing Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, so he'll have some early
Mm.
initial thoughts on that game from a couple years ago that I will try and remember and talk along with as well. And then I realized after last week's show that I forgot to discuss the Avengers War for Wakanda expansion that came out a couple weeks ago. So I'll have some thoughts on that. And that's probably it because other than that, I've just been playing more Hades. I got the platinum at like 4 a.m. this morning in that game. So I have put a ton of time into Hades on PlayStation 5, and it's just a real good game. But before we dive into any of that, a little bit of housekeeping for you. If you like what you hear, please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review, share the podcast with your friends, and all that fun stuff. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can always support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, just like our wonderful Patreon producers do. So yeah, let's kick it off probably with I imagine that the main topic of conversation, Ryan the Last Dragon. Logan, you finally sat down and watched this. This was, I
Hmm.
think, the first of the Disney Premier Access films that I actually like bought while in Premier Access. I think like the first one was what, Mulan or something like that, and I was like, I don't care enough about Mulan to do that. But Ryan the Last Dragon, I was in the right mindset for and wanted to see that movie, and it was playing in theaters around me, but like not many because obviously the pandemic was still
Yeah.
raging on at the time, and also some of the theaters just opted to not do it because the cut that Disney was asking for was going to make it like less than worthwhile
Not
for them
convincing.
with
Yeah.
everything else going on. So yeah, Premiere Access was like the way to go on it, and I watched it like a half dozen times in that first week.
So
Again,
you really liked it.
I really enjoyed it. It was one that I would have loved to, and would still eventually love to sit down and do a That D Plus show on. It's just a matter of like finding the right people because I don't want that. That is one I don't want to just be like a couple of white guys talking about Ryan the Last Dragon. I'd like to try and get some appropriate perspectives in that one for better representation and stuff. Hopefully that happens somewhere down the line. But in the meantime, on a That Nerdy Site show, we can sit down and talk about it. I gave my impressions on it, a few months back. I'm sure whenever that episode went live. But what did you think of Ryan the Last Dragon here?
Yeah, I think it is a really weird and interesting Disney movie, right? Like, I guess we'll get my hottest take on Ryan Last Dragon out of the way early on, which I have not prepared Trevor for at all,
Nope.
which is that I think the most interesting way to view the movie and the most interesting interpretation of the movie is through the lens that Raya is the villain of the movie through much of it. That she's actually the one who kind of has to have her own redemptive arc, right? And that, Fang, which I think is set up as the villains in a lot of the movie, actually aren't. They're doing a lot of their stuff through like self preservation and because they're constantly getting painted as bad guys, even though they're not necessarily any worse than everyone else. And that Raya is the one who actually is kind of doing a lot of the inciting incidents that cause a lot of the issues. And I found that way more enjoyable to watch it through because throughout a lot of the first like third of the movie, I just kept being like, I really do not like this character that much. And I kept being like, I was like, I can't put my finger on what about her, like, I'm just not clicking with. And then around, yeah, like the midpoint, it's like, oh, I think she's like sort of the bad guy here. And like, I began to kind of like develop that along as you kept watching. And then it gets to kind of, the climax and that kind of the confrontation with the cliff and the crossbow bolt and the death of the last dragon, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, she's the bad guy. Like she's the villain. Like she's the one
Spoilers
who
for
like
Raya and the Last Dragon, by the way.
spoiler alert for it's old enough, you had a chance. We're talking about the movie. But like spoiler like and I think that that's when it really clicked. Like she's the one who throughout the entire movie sort of refuses to get the core central lesson of like trust in one another, right? Like she's so unabashedly is not here for that life. To like continuously disastrous like I think results. Um and so I really enjoyed the idea of like her being the villain and then her having to realize almost sort of realize how far gone she's gone, and then kind of be like snapped out of it at the end, and obviously be the one who like spoiler it again like first sacrifices herself, right? And so I think in that context I really enjoy the idea of like this kind of being a very different Disney like heroine story, and one that I think makes it much more interesting. This is how you could have done Kylo Ren's story arc, by the way. But no, I mean, I think Raya is a really interesting character. I think through that idea, right? And I think this idea that she's a very atypical, I think, protagonist for Disney from the fact that she isn't someone who is very hopeful. She isn't someone who believes the best in others. She isn't someone who is carried by a spirit of like goodness, right? Like she's very cutthroat. She's in it for herself. She wants to bring her dad back. That's it. She doesn't really care about the rest of the world and saving them. She just wants to bring her dad back and her own kind of more selfish concerns. And that is very different than a lot of the Disney movies we usually see, and so I found that really interesting, right? And then we kind of expanded it beyond that, right? Like I think the movie is absolutely beautiful. I
Mhm.
love the colors of the film, right? Like one of the big things for me, I think, is kind of like the visual tapestry of colors that the film uses, and I think utilizes so well in telling its story, right? It's all the small details. It's kind of how richly I think created the world is, whether it's Fang or Heart or Talon, or Tail. And I think that to kind of go on this journey with them all and to kind of explore that world, and I think it is, it's not my favorite Disney movie. I won't say that, but I do think it is one that does a lot of really interesting things, and in a lot of ways kind of does its own twist on a lot of the classic tropes that you see in Disney films, and so that I really thought was neat.
I mean, I don't know if I would go so far as to say she's the villain of the movie, but I mean, she is definitely set up in a antagonistic role to her father's approach of trying to be more trusting and trying
Mhm.
to be a peacekeeper,
And Sisu's.
peacemaker, and Sisu's, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Like so there's the there is a protagonist antagonist relationship between those, but like I mean, to 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 say that she is the villain discounts that Fang are the ones who kind of like tried to take everything for themselves at the opening of the movie, and she's just she feels she doesn't trust people because she got betrayed as a kid. Like she was open to the idea, and you see kid Raya embracing her father's like notion of let's try and like bring people together. I've made this friend, let's do that. And then that friend betrays her and that is an like that leaves a scar on her that we see when we pick up with her years later, and she's praying to Sisu saying like I made a mistake, I trusted the wrong person, and the world is ruined, like I caused this. Like she sees that element, I think, and that's a very interesting and compelling dynamic. And I mean, like, and that colors, I think, what you're seeing and saying like her being, the villain or whatever. I just
Mhm.
don't think I would go as far as to call her the villain. I definitely think, obviously, she's not on the right path, and that's what her journey is about, is getting
Journey is in the film.
to trusting and really like 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 because she starts to trust people. She just doesn't trust Fang. Like she trusts Boone, and she trusts the town tongue from she ultimately ends up trusting the little con baby and stuff.
Maybe.
um
Yeah.
so she brings together that squad, but she still is hindered by that lack of trust because of like that past experience with Fang, until until it reaches that boiling point and she realizes that like not trusting people hasn't fixed anything. So yeah, let's try this. Let's get behind Sisu. Let's believe what that idea was and try and restore everything. And so yeah, I don't think it's a villain arc so much as a like almost a learning to trust again. Learning, I mean, like it is that like she was betrayed by somebody that had the potential to be a best friend as a kid or something like that, and the world was ruined because of that. So like that's going to leave any number of traumatic scars on a person, that I think the movie is very much about her kind of like overcoming those scars and reaching out and connecting with people again, thanks to Sisu and the journey of bringing all that stuff back together. So it's, I mean, it's an interesting take, and I can see like where you're coming from on it. It's just I don't,
Mhm.
I see it
Sure.
from a slightly askew lens, I guess, as more thing. But yeah, I definitely think it's an incredibly interesting, because it's not your typical like Disney princess type of
It
story. It
is not
is,
Cinderella Red, Snow
yeah,
White, right? Yeah.
and it's a very, I think, great. I mean, like I think she is a great character to follow because she has those
Mhm.
hurts and wounds that are understandable. I mean, I think, even as we're talking about it, I think of like friends who did me wrong or something like that, and the my own personal journey of like really getting to trust them again and figure out
Mhm.
what that relationship is moving forward and how to navigate those waters. Obviously they weren't world ending situations in my case. It was just like, okay, we stopped being friends for a little while in high school or something because somebody said a thing about me behind my back or something. Um but it's still like, I think that is almost a universal feeling of having trust broken in some kind of relationship or not,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
how do you repair that, how do you restore that trust?
Rebuild that.
So yeah, I think it's I think it's a great kind of morality tale in that regard, and it's definitely one that like, yeah, Disney doesn't has not examined much before. And yeah, just on your other point, obviously incredibly beautiful,
Oh, yeah.
colors and design and
100.
all that stuff. Yeah, love really all of that. The look of this, even as I was like rewatching it kind of out of the corner of my eye while I was playing Hades and stuff last night to kind of like refresh myself for the conversation. It was like when Sisu, gets the power to of rain and can start doing like the rain dance flying or whatever. It's just
Mhm.
like, oh my god. And then like especially in the finale when all the dragons are coming back, just seeing the use of color in this. Obviously this is a Disney film, not a Pixar, but like it is the same feeling I had when watching Coco on Pixar, and they go into the land of the
Mhm.
dead, and
Mm.
you see just the
Yeah.
vibrancy on screen and realize that probably took like weeks if not years to animate just that shot. um
Yeah. Yeah.
and you see something like that in this, in a Disney related, but this just actually a proper Disney animated property. um
Coco's so good.
yeah.
Um, that's a, that's a whole other podcast, but yeah, Coco's so good. I think that right, like I mean, definitely I agree, and I think the filmmakers are going more on what you're trying to say, but I like it because everything you just said about Raya can also kind of apply to Namari, right? Because she's just trying to like she, portrays Raya to a because her mom probably told her to do this, right? To like get her into good graces and then trick her so you can help out the homeland to keep us safe, right? Because we're not safe. We're always at threat of being like overrun, right? So she's a 12-year-old child too, who through the actions of her and Raya, like you said, kind of bring about this fracturing of the world
Yeah, and
into these
even there,
little
like
very surprising. So
she didn't think it was going to destroy the world. She just thought they would maybe
exactly.
get the dragon gem for Fang for a
Exactly,
while.
right? And so again, that's why I liked it of like, because the movie is interesting because there isn't really a villain, right? Like aside from like like the Droon, who are like this thing you don't ever really even they don't have a face or a form. They're just like fog basically. That's the
It
villain really,
yeah,
because even
it's
Fang by the end gets redeemed. So it's like it's interesting in that regard. There's not like a classic villain,
yeah, it's I
and
mean, it is
so
the personification of human discord and human, like,
yeah,
distrust and disagreement, and so, yes,
yeah,
when humanity is at their most distrustful and
yeah,
the gem breaks, the Droon come back in and destroy everything and wreak havoc for
yeah.
a number of years.
And so that's what I like
Don't
about
know
it
why
too.
they're
Is
weak
that like
against water, but whatever.
yeah, that just we need to make it that. But like I like the fact that you know each of these two young girls grows up and is kind of formed by that moment, and they have these clashes, but each one still kind of believes. And in some ways, right, like you could argue like I again I kind of argue Raya is um quote unquote the villain or whatever, because she's just doing it for like her and her dad and not for like all of heart, whereas like Mari's doing it for like all of Fang. She wants to keep it safe. She is like the next generation. She's been given this task by her mom, right? And so, as a 12-year-old kid, I can't imagine what that weight is like, being told like you're going to be the future, queen of this land. This is something that can help us for generations. Like do it, kind of thing. And then seeing what happens, and throughout, her mom is very much strikes me as like, she's steel. Like she's here, like she has one purpose as the ruler of Fang, and it is to keep Fang safe and Fang alone. And she feels not entirely unreasonably that the rest of the world hates them. But why they hate them, you could argue, is legitimate. But she very much feels that the rest of the world hates him and blames him for what happens. And so I think to see kind of this mixture of what goes down, and also recognize the fact that Fang wasn't the only one who led to the break-in of the dragon orb, right? Like all of the tribes ran forward and fought over it and shattered it, right? And one thing that I thought was cool is that like we never see who fires the crossbow that hits Raya's dad. Like it just shows a hand and fired it. But we never actually see if it's like the mom of like the Fang Nation or not. And so like I like the idea that like there's a head canon there of like it could have just been any one of those tribes that shot it, and they put the blame on Fang because Fang is easy to dislike, right? And then Fang gets the fall for everything going bad, even though everyone fought over the pieces and everyone led to it breaking, right? And so even like the bad guys have these very legitimate grievances and very legitimate kind of things they're fighting for. And so watching it, I just like this movie and what it did with that in terms of like the villains aren't actually villainous really. And in some ways they're heroes in their own story, right? And then the hero is in not insignificant ways also kind of a villain. And these kind of mixing and blurs of these labels and what they really even mean, I thought was a really cool. And like I think the ending sequence of like, you know, this little motley crew of people and monkeys together, like sacrifice themselves one by one to just trust in each other, was like really well done and really beautiful, right? And like gets like the central message of both Raya's dad and Sisu, which is just to trust one another, right? Which is a super topical and relevant issue, right, in today's age. And so, like, I think it really worked for me. Like, if anything, I think the weakest part of the movie in some ways is like the immediate aftermath of that, right? Like, I actually think it'd have been kind of cool, and I know why we don't get it, mainly because it's a Disney movie. Like, I'd have thought it'd been kind of cool if we don't get the dragons come back, right? Or like if they come back but like are watching above them, kind of thing. Like you don't see them just like exist in the same world, and like the humans have learned to like have taken the lessons of the dragons, right? Of like trusting one another and like believing in one another and like, you know, the goodness that the dragons represented, but like have like moved past them kind of thing now, and like have taken the legacies without them needing them as like a thing that they whatever. Again, I get why we don't get that in a Disney movie meant for like children and not necessarily 20 something adults.
Yeah.
Um, but once we get them, like you said, like that scene of all the dragons coming up and like reviving Sisu is like super well done. And then the final like bridge scene of like her coming back to her dad and then Cece being there and be like, she brought some friends, hope you don't mind. And it's like the entire world is there.
Mhm.
That works really well. I think that is a very effective, um, like scene and emotional note, right?
Yeah.
And one thing I did want to say before I forget too is that, like, because Aquafina is Sisu,
Mhm.
and it is a very Aquafina character, and in every single way that is a compliment. Like she gives it so much humor and so much heart and so much emotion. And she is such a good foil to everything that, I think Raya isn't, or has kind of closed off within herself. And so they work as such a good dynamic duo, I think. And how they kind of annoy and frustrate and bounce off each other, and how Raya can't even trust Sisu fully throughout the movie, right? Despite Sisu kind of getting her to that point of trying to.
Mhm.
And so I think, yeah, that theme and those characters worked really well for me.
Yeah, I think, it's I mean, it's an interesting take if, like, the dragons hadn't come back, or if they did come back and just, like, watched from on high or something like that.
Watch from like,
I think that undercuts I mean, I think the ending we do get here is a great ending because it's established that, when the dragons did this thing and sacrificed themselves, they brought back the humans, and the reason the dragons didn't come back is because like the humans didn't make that same sacrifice themselves. Like they needed to trust one another for everyone to come out okay from this. And so that's what, like, so when that finally happens, I appreciate that that's what brings the dragons back. Because, like, yeah, there could be an ending where only Sisu somehow came back from the dead or whatever as a result, but I appreciate that, like, the humans finally learned the lesson from the dragons from 500 years ago, and like
mhm.
were willing to like work together. And even that, like, even that's a very like very base reading of the thing, because really it's like five
Very,
humans like five humans sat down and like finally trusted one another. There's still people
but it
in
builds from
in
there.
I
It
mean, yeah,
builds from there.
of course that,
Yeah,
like, that that seed sets in
yeah,
motion
exactly.
the option for the opportunity for the rest of people. Again, like, it wasn't a new idea. The dad tried to do it 5 years earlier, 6 years earlier, whatever it was.
Yeah,
um and I remember one of my first takeaways on this was how great Daniel Day Kim is as the
hundred
father.
percent,
Because yeah, he does,
100%.
like, he's really there in the beginning and sets up a lot of like the stakes and driving momentum and the philosophy
Yeah,
behind what needs to solve this thing. And if he's not as good as he is in that role, and he's not as earnest, and you don't care for him as much, then Raya's drive to bring him back doesn't have the weight, and his
yeah,
like mission to bring the world back together doesn't seem possible, doesn't seem feasible. So like he had to do a lot with relatively little screen time in
very
the
limited.
beginning, but
Yeah,
I thought he did a great job, kind of really setting the stage for what this movie's journey needs to be. And I love that, like, I love the moment that comes back when the motley crew are like making the food, and it's too spicy, and no, you need this, you need this, and she brings back in the recipe, and that he had at the beginning, that was going to like bring everybody together and
bring it.
everybody's cultures together in this phenomenal meal. And I love that, like, that gets an echo later on in the film. And yeah, the like the the whirlwind of trauma of meeting your daughter again, and she's 6 years older, um suddenly, and you've missed out on 6 years of her life and 6 years of the world. And then, but like in that time, she was able to bring everybody together, bring everybody back, and has that like welcome to Kumandra moment. Like, she has fulfilled his vision, his dream,
Mhm.
and that's the world he gets to come back to. Is a really cool, like, I teared up, like, again, even half watching it last night, and even just like thinking about it now, I've got like tears welling up in my eyes, because I think it's wonderfully executed.
I
And
think,
yeah.
yeah, I think I love the idea, right, that this movie explores with so often these, you know, this movie deals with like legacies, I think, and history in a really interesting way for any movie, honestly, but let alone a Disney movie, which I think oftentimes can be boiled down to like pretty simplistic themes and ideas. And this one I think does kind of revel in exploring more complex ideas and themes and issues. And I think its take on legacies and history, right? And the fact that her father is someone who just seeks to unify people, right? And have them have faith in one another and believe in one another. And like, is this figure who's kind of seemingly, pushing against windmills and to get to the point where you see at the end of the movie, like his kind of core ideology of the world has been fulfilled, right? It has been reaffirmed. I think is super beautiful, right? And I think it deals with the idea that like so often throughout history, these are the figures who don't necessarily live to see their work finished and fulfilled, right? Um, and I think for him to actually have that moment where he can see kind of the journey completed that he had started, like the seed that he laid be like kind of very visibly sprouted in front of him, both in his daughter and in all the tribes coming together, I think is super beautiful, right? And it is a really cool, I think, version of that story that so often throughout history those men and women aren't afforded the opportunity to see, right? Their own life's work and what it really means to everyone else. And in that same vein, right? Like one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is when Sisu takes Raya back to the heart, like temple, like
Mhm.
area, basically, where like the orb had been smashed, and like introduces her to the like her brother and sisters, and gives kind of the run of each one of them, and like takes her back to that scene where like everything was hit in the fan, and like she has a line of like, it could have been any one of us. I don't know why they chose me, right? And in that instance, what popped in my head was the reason they chose you is because you trusted them, right? Like you were the one who trusted everyone so much, Cece, right? Like Cece was the one who was just so full of trust and like belief and faith in others, right? And she just knew that like if they did this, they put her faith in her, like she'd be reaffirmed in that. And that's what she kind of said the very next line. And so I love the idea that like the reason it was Cece wasn't just random. It wasn't because they went and picked straws out of her hat and said, "We're gonna give it to you." It's because they knew that she was the one of the five dragon siblings that was the most trusted, right? That saw the best in humanity and also dragon kind, I guess, right? Like she was the one who sort of was the best of them, even if she wasn't the most powerful or the smartest or the cleverest, like she kind of kept saying all the other siblings were. She was the one who ultimately had kind of that purest heart. And so I think that scene and seeing each of the dragons put their powers into the thing and then give it to her, and then her watch them all kind of get frozen to stone, and then just be like, and I knew I could do it at that moment because you know, they had put their trust in me, and like I, felt more powerful than I ever knew I could be, and then doing the thing that saved the world, I think was such a cool, you know, 3 to 4 minute scene that basically encapsulates the entire movie's theme and like journey and story all right there. And then to see that kind of reenacted later on, where Raya is the one who sacrifices herself first to give everyone else the push to be like, you have to trust everyone, even our quote unquote enemies. I think was beautifully paid off at the end of the movie, and like how it kind of wrapped its own journey up with like the human side of things.
Yeah, I love the ending bit as well. Even before that, I love kind of the rest of the team like realizing they need to help these other people.
Yeah.
Like despite that they're Fang, despite that everybody hates Fang in this in this society, like these are innocent people that are about to be turned to stone, and we have a thing that can help them and can prevent that. So like we need to put that bias aside and do it. And it is kind of a it is a great again. Uh, I wish the world took more lessons of that. Of like, hey, we need to put aside our personal like interests for the greater good of this society and to try and keep them alive. Um,
Can, can I tell you, I loved that scene for that reason you just said, and also because they did it in spite of Raya, right? They did it
yeah,
in spite of her not being able to do it, right? She just was completely consumed by rage by that point, right? That she wasn't able to trust him, or she just lost it basically. and they did it in spite of kind of their leader, right? Like even after their leader had kind of just like gone off the rails, they still knew the correct thing to do in that moment wasn't to run away selfishly in their own direction, but it was like we have the ability to make a difference. We have to do that, right? And so I thought, and then it is through their actions that she's turned back to like snapping out of her anger and seeing them like save everyone is what leads her back into going down that path again, right? And so I love the idea that it's not like through her giving like this like triumphant like St. Crispin's Day speech that rallies the troops. It's the troops that rally her back and to kind of come back into the light, right? And I thought that was a really cool like twist on what we so often see in a lot of these like hero's journey stories.
Hmm.
And I think it was made even better, like you said, by them going into the heart of Fang, where you can trust anyone but a Fang person, right? And so to see them do that, right, to see them kind of take that step ahead of the person who was supposed to be guiding them, I thought was really cool and a really interesting interpretation of a hero and a leader's dynamic with the people who were supposed to theoretically be like following them, they're supposed to be leading. um I think like the movie's just smart and really clever on so many levels, right? And I think there's so much to unpack it, and I think it so often is smarter and a step ahead of where you think it's going. And I thought that was really, really like neat, even down to when they went to, I can't remember the name of it, but like the big forest like northern
Spine.
like Axewood troops. Yeah, thank you. Who are like the most vicious, brutal warriors, right? And the lone person who's left is someone who's just incredibly lonely and sad because he's lost his family, right? And I thought that was like his mini story arc is maybe my favorite because it's I think the one that's like the most beautifully done. Where like especially as like his growing bond with like the Khan baby because he lost his own child, right? And I thought that was like really beautifully done. And, like him like doing just really basic things that like none of the other characters thought to do, like check her collar and it's like her name is right there. Did you not think of that? How are you like are you all just stupid, right? And like him doing just basic dad shit. And I thought his relationship with the Khan baby and his relationship with like all the characters, right? Like because he is the only adult there, really.
Yeah, I mean
And so
it is
him,
a world that has been orphaned many times over,
yeah,
and they are like an epitome of that. Like that whole.
yeah,
I remember
I love.
Honest Trailers did like their video on it, and and they basically like they're like Raya is an orphan, Boone is an orphan, the little Khan baby is an orphan, and Ton is probably probably also an orphan. Did they just like pull and Namari by the end gets orphaned by with her mom? So it's like, did they just pull off the rare quintuple orphan?
You rarely see, you don't see that one too often. And
Yeah.
so like I don't know, like I thought it was really cool. And I think one thing I thought was really clever is apart from the like Fang leader, all the other leaders were kind of done in by their own like desperate like desire to keep power, right, and to keep the orb near them, right? Like, and I thought that was a really clever idea of like this thing is sort of like the ring from other rings. Like, it's a very corrupting like thing. If you try to keep it for your own selfish purposes, like it will kind of do you in, right? And you could argue even Fang it did, right? Like she, they're a very prosperous place, but one that the rest of the world hates, right? And the rest of the world doesn't trust, right? And even within Fang, like she stayed alive and kept her people alive, but it's made her very paranoid, right? And so I liked that if you try to use it for that end, you'll either be clinging to it as you're frozen to stone, like the one from the first place they go to, have it stolen away from you, like in the next place, or have your entire society like wiped out, like in Spine, like you said, or just become a paranoid, closed off world, like in Fang. And so
And even
I,
before the gem gets like shattered, everybody outside of Heart resents Heart because they think that the gem is
yeah,
bringing them prosperity. And that's like there's even this weird like meta thing of like, well, like maybe it was because like we see Fang who has like the biggest chunk later on, and they're clearly the most prosperous of the remaining societies. So like maybe maybe there was some truth behind that of like the dragon power was leading to good fortune and whatnot, and maybe like Chief Benta was a little naive thinking that it wasn't.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. Like I like the idea too of just, I think there's this movie's so interesting. Definitely talking about it has made me like it more. I think there's just so many layers to it, right? And I think, like I said, I appreciate I think a level of respect it has to people that are going to be watching it, right? In terms of like their ability to understand these themes, both surface level and more complex, right? Like one of the things I commonly say for like you know kids movies or animated movies that are directed not towards like adults kind of thing that make them stand out as like great ones versus ones that aren't that good are how much they respect the intelligence of the audience watching it, right? And I say it's the same thing for books too, right? Like if you think that the kids watching this thing are stupid, well, kids aren't stupid, and they're gonna pick up on that on some level, and I think recognize that, right? And I think it's one of the reasons, right? Right, like my old stomping horse. It's one of the reasons why I think Mr. Rogers has endured, right? Like he's someone who I think never treated kids as stupid, right? He always willing to like broach these really complex and controversial ideas and topics with children. I think you see it in the best of like kids movies, like Lion King, which is basically just Hamlet, but in like animated form, right? And so I think similarly here you see it deal with these themes in a very mature and I think adult manner at times, both in its protagonist, who in a lot of ways is a very non-traditional protagonist, and its kind of villains who in a lot of ways aren't very villainous, and just the larger world around them, the themes it's dealing with. And so I think that allows for it to be open to so much more interpretation and layered kind of conversations around it. And so yeah, I mean, I think like I kind of began at the beginning, like I don't think it's I mean, it's not my favorite Disney movie, but I definitely think it's one of the ones that I could probably spend the most time talking about, like with different people and like unpacking the different elements of it. And unpacking just what makes like each of the characters and each of like the cultures it goes for so unique and special, and the themes it's tackling. Um, and I think it's one of the Disney movies I feel like I could probably. You're a great example of this. I feel like it's one of the movies I could most watch again and again and again, and still pull new things from, and still enjoy like more and more on each repeated viewing. Versus like Cars, which like no disrespect to Cars, but like there's only so much there, right? And this
Hmm.
feels much more like a Pixar movie in the best parts of that word than a like classic Disney movie. And I think that's a testament to what they were able to achieve.
Yeah, and I definitely think the track that like the classic Disney movies have been on in recent years has almost been a reevaluation and like this reexamination of their own history, and like,
Mhm.
wow, yeah, we kind of like we have a generation, we have generations that grew up with like damsel in distress princesses, and maybe we can tell stories that go beyond that for a modern society, more a modern kind of era. And so I like the Frozen films, and now Raya. It's like you can still
Oh, 100.
have those princesses, but they don't have to be the damsel in distress. They can be the ones out there leading the charge, the ones trying to save their dad, save other people, bring the world back together, whatever that is. And it's I think that is like I love that like the generation of little girls out there are getting those kinds of stories as well. And like that's not to say that like little boys can't also still like pull things from these
100%.
movies. The fact that one of the things I wanted to touch on is like this movie also has just great action in the
Yep.
sword fights between Raya and Namari in particular. And like that is something that if I was a little kid watching this, I would like, I don't care that they're girls doing that. I would get a sword and
So
like have
cool.
fun doing that same kind of
Uh,
stuff. And it's like really cool fights and sequences in that regard. And so yeah, I love that, like, this generation of kids is getting a wider scope of what it means to be any of these kinds of like characters and archetypes, and you're getting just a wider, like, just better representation across the board in terms of obviously like ethnic representation in a
That's
film
what I
like
was going to
this,
talk about.
but
That's
also
my last
in
question.
just like in gender roles and those dynamics and stuff like that. Even the idea that I don't think it's I don't think it is a shortcoming on the film. I think it is very intentional that this film leaves what the relationship between Raya and Namari could ultimately evolve into open ended. Like, whether that is a romantic relationship between those two characters or just, a great friendship that will go on, across their different kingdoms or whatever. Like, I think there is a cool potential there that leaves that open to kids to interpret, kids and adults and anybody really, to interpret and kind of create their own headcanon around it, of like I it's almost the inverse argument that I mean, it's not even the inverse argument. Like, when we talked about like Finn and Poe in our summer Star Wars
Hmm.
stuff, the idea came up of like a lot of people shipping them, and I'm like, yeah, but like we very clearly got Finn interested in Rey. Like, that's established in the movie there. So I think there was just a vocal community that was trying to create something that wasn't necessarily the intent. Whereas I think I mean, there isn't stated interests in either of those other characters, and so and clearly they had a deep connection, and one that wounded both of them when when they betray each other over the course of the film and stuff. And so there's just like a great potential even on that front that I love that Disney is being more open to exploring. And yeah, they might not like set it in stone because they might fear, that how that would be portrayed in other regions, but they can, like, it would not surprise me if the writers kind of have in their head canon that those two end up being a couple or something like that. Um,
I
you know,
like. I mean, this is. I mean, this is a spinoff to a whole other conversation in some degrees, but I think to the idea of I feel like I've over time become more and more open, and I think I like the idea more and more of like in terms of like once a creator does a thing, who kind of has ownership of that thing, right? And the reality situation is once they tell the story, that story will take on a million different lives because it's going to impact each person differently, and they're going to have different interpretation of it and different things they pull from it. And if you're not going to be very explicit about what you want to happen because you don't care because you're not thinking about that thing, right? Then yeah, like that's I think where headcanon comes in totally handy, right? Like I think there's no like I don't think it matters, right? Like I think whether their relationship is one of friendship or whether it's a romantic one, the same for Finn and Poe. Like I think if that's how someone wants to read that and that helps them on their own, journey and sense of discovery and just feeling good, um, then that is sort of just as true as any other interpretation, because that's kind of the beauty of storytelling and sometimes the drawback in terms of other ways people can pull things like in the Last Jedi, like flashback. But that's storytelling, right? Like once the story is told, it's up to the audience to interpret it how they want to interpret, right? And even if the creator comes out and tries to be very explicit about it after the fact, or fill in blanks that didn't exist, JK, that it doesn't really matter because it's already taken on a larger life, right? Like it's grown and taken on something that they either didn't see or weren't thinking about, or maybe didn't fully realize the extent of how far they wanted to push it, right? And I think, you know, I often take this argument and then say, look at the example between J.K. and Harry Potter and George Lucas and Star Wars. And George Lucas and Star Wars is just kind of like everyone do whatever you want. That's a sandbox for everyone to play in, right? Like I'm gonna do my shit in it, and I think it's pretty neat. And then I'm gonna do nothing for 20 years. I'm gonna come back to it because I want to play the toys again, and I'm gonna play the toys, right? And I think George Lucas very much I have interpreted has always viewed Star Wars as sort of like these are toys in a toy chest, and I'm gonna take them out and play them whenever I want to, and then otherwise I'm gonna let the other kids play with them, right? And do their own thing with them, and do their own stories. And you see it in like the massive expanded universe of Star Wars, right? That I largely think is pretty hit or miss, but is like really in a lot of ways unique to almost anything else that
Mhm.
exists in media, right? Like that is just like that Wild West and that like open to just doing everything, right?
I mean, we talked about on
Um,
the Empire of Dreams episode that you weren't able to make. We talked about the idea
yeah,
that like Visions is coming out, Star Wars Visions, like anime
yeah,
anime studios are getting a
yeah.
crack at Star Wars, and it's not canon or whatever, but it's still like they're gonna get to play with that. And so we definitely
It's gonna
talked
be
about
so cool,
bringing Christian back on for that one. But yeah, just like
and I
it
think
is
that's
a
a
very
cool
cool,
idea.
yeah, open, like it's basically open source. They're like Star Wars is almost the anti Nintendo in that regard, whereas like
Yeah,
anybody tries to do
yeah,
anything Nintendo wise, Nintendo's lawyers go out and like lock it down. But like
yeah.
I have like I have a fan film that some
Yep,
friends
that's what we
made.
talked about.
Um actually, like the fan film I have is friends of mine made Star Wars fan films and like put them in like film festivals and stuff like that. And I don't have that because they never like released that, because then Lucasfilm like lawyers would probably get involved or whatever. But I have like other of their work that that like was their original work that caught my eye because they had done these cool Star Wars fan film things. And yeah, you just have a
Yeah.
million cases like that out there.
Yeah, and there's so many cool like YouTube things, right? Like fans doing like, like a stormtrooper's story and journey, right? And like all this kind of stuff, right? And I think whether it is in novels or comics or video games or obviously movies, Star Wars is so comfortable just saying, why can't all this stuff exist? Why can't it exist even if it contradicts one another? Like it is just kids playing in a play box, and so it will contradict itself sometimes, and it won't necessarily make sense at times. And it's when you try to put dates on things that I think Star Wars kind of gets bogged down. Like it doesn't need that. Like it, I think tell the stories you want to tell, and then let everyone tell the same stories, right? Versus I think JK has such a tight leash around the neck of Harry Potter, and she has to have it always around there, and it's led to really great stories, obviously, but it's also led to, I think, in some ways, a suffocation of that world, and an inability to break away from this set period of time. It is a world that takes place in ours. So there could be hundreds of years, there could be centuries of stories told in Harry Potter, and there is almost a refusal to ever break that far away from Harry Potter. You have to kind of always connect it back no matter what you're doing. Um, and so to like the point where like Fantastic Beast ultimately becomes not about Fantastic Beast and Newt, but about Dumbledore, so that they can make it that much closer to Harry Potter again, right? And I think Star Wars and a lot of the best stories are ones that are comfortable doing different things on, right? And that are kind of like you said, open source and crowdsourced, and like, hey, I have an idea, like let's do it, right? And I think that Disney, in its own way, kind of is doing that with, like you said, its new take on its giant 70 plus year hit, God, more than that, 80 or 90 year history almost, of films, and with these modern films, whether it's like Moana or Frozen or Raya here, in terms of doing things and saying, "Hey, look, we've done these damsel in distress stories, but like maybe we can do stories for people who don't have blonde hair and blue eyes and pale skin, right? Like, let's also tell their stories in some ways, and let's also tell stories that don't need to have a love story in them, right? In a romantic relationship, right? Or like a really prominent male character in any way in this movie, right? Like doesn't get introduced. Arguably, that's not a child until 2/3 of the way through the movie, and even then, he's a very atypical male character, right? That his appearance is one of like a marauding murderous, ravenous, killer, and instead he's a very quiet, gentle soul who's grieving for her family, right? And I think that's really cool. And in Moana, you don't see a prominent male figure that's not a father figure or a demigod at all in that movie, right? And I think, or and Frozen too, like they do very different takes on male characters, and I think that's really rad. Like it's a really cool thing to see kind of continuously be evolved. And I think you saw Star Wars do that itself in varying degrees of success. Some would argue, but I don't think it's a mistake that like there are a lot of people out there, boys and girls, that look at like Ahsoka in a way that I never will, because I kind of missed the boat on that in a large degree, but I find really interesting, right? Like, and today, as we record this podcast, I saw people talk about how, like, whether Ahsoka or Luke is stronger than the other one. And like, I think the whole conversation is really stupid. Just to be clear about that. It doesn't matter. But B, I think it is indicative of the fact that they've built up this strong, amazing female character that could actually be, comparable in some way with Luke. Not necessarily in terms of like pop culture, I think impact, because there are few characters in anything that are as big as Luke
Hmm.
Skywalker, obviously. But in terms of like within that fandom, and like that I find really cool. Or Rey as well, right? Like the modern faces of Star Wars are in a lot of ways not the traditional faces they've been, and that's really interesting. Like even like the Mandalorian is very different in his own way, and so I think that's something that, to kind of wrap it back up to like Raya for like one last thing, like I find really cool with the movie as well is, this is a movie that is probably much more reminiscent and much more true to the audience watching it than Snow White or Cinderella is in 2021 America, to say nothing of the world at large, right? And I think that's super exciting to see, right? And like this is much like, I will say, this is probably, it's cool to see this because this is probably much more of the movies that like my future kids, for example, will identify with much more than those movies.
Hmm.
And it's cool to see that reflected on screen.
Yeah, agreed. It's
Yeah.
it's one of those. I mean, like, just even like taking kind of that, especially the early catalog of like Disney films of your Cinderella, your Snow
Yeah.
White, your Sleeping Beauty.
Rapunzel
It
and
is
Beauty.
like it's taking these like classic fairy tale archetypes and just telling those same old stories in a new way with a little bit of extra
Mhm.
kind of like essence to it. And then that would continue on with like Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. Those are
Yeah.
old stories that are being told in a new sense, but how much thought was put into making those stories for the period they lived in, the period they were in. Like there
Mhm.
aren't, you know,
Mhm.
crazy scenes in Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty that don't go really beyond the like, hey, stay out of the woods because the woods are a scary place, because that's what the whole idea of Grimm's fairy tales was. Like
Mhm.
it was, those were like warnings to kids to like don't go into the woods
Yeah.
because like
Yeah.
things will eat you there.
Wolves
Um
are there. Yeah.
exactly. Like how much like are there added like sociological layers really thrown into those movies from the 30s through 50s or whatever in Disney versus
Yeah.
like the movies that we're getting today that are existing as a conversation with the eras they're being made in, that is, I think, just more interesting across the board. Yes, they and in 50 years time will probably be looked at with a, I think, a more discerning lens than
Mm.
we look back to the Disney movies from 50 years ago now, kind of thing. So yeah, it'll be very fascinating to see kind of the conversation of Disney evolve over time. Um,
Agreed.
anyway, good chatting about Raya and the Last Dragon.
100%.
Glad I now have somebody else who has watched it that I can geek out about with it. And while I, again, like as we kind of touched on early on, like while I disagree with your initial like viewing Raya as the villain
Mhm.
per se, like I get where you're coming from with it, and
Yeah.
I do think that the conflict that Raya experiences and introduces into the story is very intentional. I just don't, I don't go full fledged like the villain in the thing for me is distrust and the Droon,
Yeah.
and there aren't like and our heroes, which is really all of that team that ends up sacrificing themselves, including Namari, have to
Mhm.
overcome that, and the societal like pressure upon them that led to that distrust in the first place. So it is like it is not a it's another element of like the people at Disney recognizing that the world isn't just heroes and villains. It isn't just like it is a much broader spectrum of kind of
Mhm.
characters that you will explore in stories like this. So I appreciate that it isn't like it can't easily just be boiled down to like this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. From the perspectives that we see, Raya is poised as the good guy because we're getting most of the story from her perspective, but
Her perspective.
and her perspective is has a very anti-Fang bias, even from like early on when she's telling her dad about like, what do you know about all these people? And they're like, well, these guys are sneaks, these guys are,
It's
you know, these
worse,
guys are,
yeah.
and Fang is terrible, they're assassins, they'll like the and even Tong, and that's, you know, that's not unique to Rai, because Tong even says like their blades are designed specifically to stab in your backs or whatever, like that is a thing that Spine knows about Fang too and stuff. So yeah, it's all about, you know, the stories people tell and how those stories kind of become conflated over time, and who is the hero in their own stories, I guess. Yeah, so
The movie is a giant game of telephone.
there you
Um,
go. Yeah, it would be interesting to see if they did like a Raya 2 or something that was like, you know, of from the perspective of Fang during the dark times or something like that. Like some I don't know how what I don't know what other stories you could tell in there, that would be maybe as effective, but it would be interesting to see in the same way. So obviously this movie came out around the same time a lot of people, myself included, had gotten eyes on Avatar: The Last Airbender because that had just come out on Netflix and stuff, and so it was, you know, easily accessible to a ton of people. And there are a lot, like there are, you know, warring cultures kind of at, you know, there, so there are similarities to be drawn there. And it's the idea of like, in Avatar, you know, we experience most of that story from the perspective of like a pair of waterbenders, but then when you see like stories from, you know, the Fire Nation or something like that, it is, you know, they're not seeing themselves as bad guys, which the waterbenders see them as. They're just, you're seeing their perspective. So like, what would a day in the life of somebody from Fang look like in this kind of world in the lead up to all this? Or what, you know, what would a day in Namari's life like if this story had been told from Namari's perspective? What would that have looked like? All
from another
very
point of view.
interesting dynamics, but uh you know, we'll discuss that if they ever make another movie or something. But segueing off from that, just to talk briefly about Avengers: War for Wakanda.
Mhm.
I so I sat down with this, you know, a couple weeks ago when it came out, as you know, the resident Avengers stan of last year for that nerdy
Yeah.
site. Um, uh, Hopping into so my like history with Avengers at this point has been I hopped in for the Kate Bishop stuff when that came out, enjoyed it, ended up getting Kate I think to max level, and I hopped in for the Hawkeye stuff, played it, it was fine, and sort of like gave me an understanding of what to expect from these things. And War for Wakanda, I didn't really like look at a whole bunch of the stuff in the lead up to it. It was just kind of like it's coming out, I'll just play through the story when the time comes. But it seemed like it was being built up to be like, you know, a few steps above the Hawkeye and the Kate Bishop releases, which were really just kind of like, here's a few story missions to tell a story with this character. And War for Wakanda is pretty much just that, but with T'Challa. And the one thing it has that those other two didn't, I guess, is that it gives you like a new outpost, so like a new home base, because you can basically, you know, go to Wakanda, and there's like a home base outpost there where you can talk to the characters and, you know, buy stuff from shops or whatever. Um, and I was ultimately like very disappointed by that. I was like, this is not like they were. It seemed like they were selling it as somebody who wasn't like, looking at the ins and outs of everything. It seemed like they were selling it as like this is a proper expansion. The game's been out a year now. Like this is a sense of what the future of the thing can be. So here's going to be another, 5 to 10 hour experience, whatever. And it just wasn't. I went like, I,
Mm.
I stepped away from like playing through the Black Panther missions at one point and then came back to it and was like amazed to see that I was already like 66% of the way through. Cause I like, it'd only been like an hour or something like that. I was like, oh my God, I'm like, I'm almost done with this story. And sure, there are like, just like with the rest of that game, there are levels that you can replay over and over again and stuff and do the grind. And it's just, I'm just at the point where I don't care anymore. Avengers has
Mm.
reached the Destiny 2 threshold for me where I just like these live as service games or live service games as a service. That's what I was trying to come up with. Almost like to paraphrase the line from The Dark Knight, like they either like die while they're a
Mm.
hero or they live long enough to become the villain. And Destiny 2 did that for me. Avengers has now done that for me where I just like I played
Fall
through
Guys
this.
did it for you.
Fall Guys did it for me, yeah. Where I played through it and like the story was fine. Like good performances from everybody that's coming in there. I have no qualms about that, but like the gameplay is largely the same. Black Panther feels like the most comparable would probably be like a Black Widow type character because he's basically an on the ground brawler. Um, uh, and I did not have a great like a lot of the levels actually seem to be like designed almost like you have to have like other people playing because there were a lot of things like a lot of the levels in the missions were like okay you got to defend these 3 points now and they're going to be just waves of enemies hitting all 3 points and if you're a squad of actual like 4 actual players you can kind of like divide and conquer but me playing with my three top like because I have like 4 characters that are max level in that game and having 3 other AIs they're all like max level I was still losing like point after point. And that doesn't cause a mission failure or whatever, but it was like, well, I got like 2 stars on some of those missions or whatever. And I was like, well, I don't know how I could have done that better to try and do that as a 5 star thing without having other people and like actually trying to divide and conquer. And I was just like, I'm not interested in trying to replay those stuff. They've also changed a lot of like the UI elements around since I last hopped into the game. So it was like very unfamiliar on that front as well. And I was like, okay, now I got to figure out how to do some of this stuff again, which was annoying. Like like it took me probably a good 10 minutes to even just like get into the Black Panther missions because I I tried to like I clicked the like do the Panther operation thing and then it loaded me in as Kamala Khan and I was like, well, okay. And I was like, do I need to go to Wakanda? There wasn't anything like prompting me to like, hey, if you want to start the Black Panther quest line, do this.
Do it here.
And so like I was like, well, I went to like the war table or whatever. And I was like, well, I can go to Wakanda. So do I just need to go to Wakanda and start things? And you go to Wakanda and everybody talks to you as if like you've already been there before. And they're like, welcome back and stuff. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. And I finally like through trial and error just realized, oh, I need to switch to play as the Black Panther character. I need to switch my character because I think in other ones it was like, hey, you're going to start this quest line off as whatever character you're playing as, but then you're going to get introduced to these other characters. And so that's what it was. It was like I had to switch to being the Black Panther to go and start the Black Panther quest line and get the like those quests
Mm.
available to me because they were specific to him. You could only play them as Black Panther, and I was just like, that's like that was more obtuse than I felt like it should have been. There should have been something like guiding me to that. And there was just like a few instances of that kind of thing throughout my time with it, where I
Mm.
was just like, I don't like I'm just not interested enough to like I played through the story and I have zero interest to grind through and try and get other costumes or any of that other stuff and so I'm just like I may be I mean, like, this may just be my relationship with Avengers at this point. Is I'll
Yeah.
hop in
Yeah.
when a new story expansion comes out. I'll try and figure out how to play through that story expansion and just be like, okay, that was a cool little thing. But even playing this just started making me realize how, like, I liked the combat for what it was at the time or whatever, and it was
Mhm.
probably more that I liked it enough and there wasn't anything else drawing my attention. Whereas, like,
They
when I was hopping
yeah.
into War for Wakanda, I was like, I would much rather be playing Final Fantasy 14 right now. And then a few days later, I was basically like, I'm gonna hop into Hades, and then just have not gone back to Avengers at all. So yeah, it's just like, I'm not interested in going into that game for the dailies. I'm not interested in doing the grinds for like the elite level gear or whatever. It's just, I don't, because at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff just doesn't matter anyway. Like, you can be level 10 and beat these guys up, and you can be level 150 and still going to take just as much time and energy to beat those guys up. So yeah, I've definitely reached the point where I just don't care about Avengers really, and that's like,
Mm,
that's death for a game like that. And I don't know.
yeah.
I wonder how many people they were able to get back with this. I wonder if they had people that came back and stuck with it. Um,
Yeah.
because it nothing nothing about it. Oh, and that, like, maybe the most egregious thing was that, like, they don't have a Wakanda forever emote. Like, I was like, that's got to be like a given that you would do the, like, this thing in that. and and it just feels like the fact that it's not there suggests to me that they're probably going to try and sell it down the line. They're going to add it as like a an emote that you can buy in the
Mm,
marketplace, which, yes, you can like buy marketplace things with like in-game currency and stuff, but I'm just like, I don't know how you miss something like that um amongst everything else. But yeah, it was just, ultimately, I was disappointed. I thought it was going to be a bigger thing. I thought, especially, this is, ultimately an unfair comparison, I'm sure, but like, I'm going through in Final Fantasy 14. I played the base game of Final Fantasy 14, which was like, 50 hours long or whatever, and I've put like 20 hours into the Heavensward stuff, which was like their first major expansion, which admittedly they sold as basically a like full priced expansion to that game, compared to Avengers, where you bought the base game, you get everything else we put in there. Um, but it was too much in line with the previous Hawkeye stuff, where we got two Hawkeyes back to back, that I'm just like, I don't, until there's like a real next chapter in this story that's going to be a meaty 10 to 15 hour experience, I just don't know why I would come back to the game in the meantime.
yeah.
Like, even when the next one drops, there's like, I may not even just hop into it. I'll just kind of like let some things bank up and just be like, okay, now there's probably enough content for me to hop back into in Avengers. And if I get to that point, there's a more than likely chance I'm just not going to go back, even when there is more stuff in there for me banked up. So that was disappointing, and frustrating, and then ultimately at the end of the day, I'm just like, God, I wasted so much time with this game. Like, what other things could I have done with my life instead of getting behind and
Playing Avengers.
supporting and being out there as like a champion for for that game, getting the platinum and all that stuff. Just being like, yeah, I could have done other things and probably better things. I could have
Mhm,
like read actual comics or something, that would have
mhm.
not left me as like frustrated at the end of the day. Because there's also still just a lot of like terrible game design choices in there that I just do not vibe with.
Mm,
The most egregious that always gets me is, if you're playing solo, like, you're locked to a number of revives in a mission, where, like, yeah, you can die and it's not like game over. Your team can come revive you, but you only get that like 3 times, and then you have to like restart. And it's like, what is the point of that? How does that benefit anybody if I die a fourth time and I have to restart this whole thing over again? How does that help the game? How does it help me as a player? Because if you're playing with like actual other party members, you're not limited to those kinds of like restrictions. So yeah, I don't it I that happened to me, where, and that was basically what got me to finally turn the thing off. Is I was playing like another mission after beating the story, and I was like, all right, screw it, I don't care. I don't care enough to deal with that frustration. I'm gonna go die over and over and over again in Hades, where even there, there's some reward to those deaths, and there's a reason for those deaths. And
Mm.
so yeah, I just War for Wakanda, and so yeah, the fact that I completely forgot that I had played it for last week for before last week's episode, I was like,
Not a great.
not a great thing. So there are my Avengers War for Wakanda thoughts. Um, so let's throw it back over to you, Logan, to
Yes.
talk about
Mhm.
another film that you sat down and watched, Annihilation. Give me your Annihilation thoughts.
This is gonna be Logan's 60-second review of Annihilation. We don't really need to delve any more into that.
Yeah,
I think Annihilation is totally fine. I
just
think it's good.
for this one, can you give me like a broad strokes, like this is what the movie's about?
God. Yeah, I think in the broadest strokes possible. The elevator pitch, right, is there is a like force field called the Shimmer that is like descended on this spot in like a coastal area of America. It is slowly getting bigger. It's been there for 3 years. Anyone who enters it doesn't come back, except for one person, Oscar Isaac's character, who is the husband of Natalie Portman. He comes back at like the beginning of the movie, basically, and it like sets off a chain reaction that leads to her going in with like a group of 5 women, and it's basically their journey from there on in the Shimmer. Once you're in this Shimmer, I can't give you any sort of elevator pitch because the movie's very trippy. It is super weird. It deals with both like time and like physics and DNA and biology and metaphysics and all these different things and like twisty, timey, wimey balls of stuff, as a Doctor Who quote would be, and so I think you either like that or you don't, and I think you either like the fact. I think the way I worded it to before I started recording was the movie asks a lot of questions that has no intention of ever answering, and you either like that approach to storytelling or you don't. I didn't love it. I don't hate the movie either. I think the movie, again, I think it's fine. I think it's good. There are scenes that I think are like brilliantly done. There's one in particular that is maybe the most pure like horror scene in the movie that I think is also one of the best parts of the movie because it incorporates what is happening in the Shimmer and like that world in a really cool way. Um, but then there are lots of other parts that I don't like as much. I think the end is, I mean, I wouldn't imagine to be that hard to, Google confirm this, but I would imagine the ending is pretty controversial and divisive among people who watch a movie, probably because it is a very out there ending. It is like super open for interpretation and very ambiguous and very like, what do you think? And I can definitely see people not liking that. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. I think the ending, I think parts of it were like, I think the biggest criticism I have of Annihilation is that it constantly gets in its own way by its inability to set any sort of rules for the world down. And so I never know if what I'm watching makes sense within that context. I never know if this is something that is like, the movie has no rules for it to follow, which I think is both interesting in like a liberating sense and also in a yeah, but I don't know what to make of any of this information I'm getting sense in. They're just saying science facts at me, and I don't know how to process them now because I've been given no like template. I think Natalie Portman is gives a great performance. I think the whole core female cast gives a great performance. Um, but Natalie Portman is a lot of this movie. I just wish her character was more interesting because I actually find her character the least compelling of the like 5 women that go into the Shimmer together. Um, but maybe Natalie Portman does not Portman. She gives like it everything she has. I think the the last thing I'll say is I think the movie's ending, which I said I would be stunned if it's not divisive. I think is one that comes so close to finally giving you answers and then pulls it back and it's like, what if instead we just throw more question marks at you? And so like I left it kind of like, oh, I wish I had just anything to think. Like that's what when we got to watching it, like Trevor looked at me and goes like, what do you think? And it's like, I need more time to process it because I really don't know what to think because I just have the same questions I had when the movie started, and none of them have been answered really, and so I don't really know how to process that information. Um, but the one thing I will give the movie unquestionably, and the last thing kind of will say on it is visually, it is beautifully shot, and there's some scenes I think that are just visual delights, like just pure eye candy. It is great. Tessa Thompson in particular has like her like send off scene is like super cool. Um, and yeah, what it does in terms of like the change in biology of the world and DNA and stuff, like the visual elements of that are really really neat. But it's a weird film to pin down, right? It falls into like science fiction and also kind of like a psychological thriller. It's unnerving. um, there are like moments of action, there are moments of pure just like horror. Really, that's in just like one scene in particular. And then it is a movie that is super ambiguous, open for interpretation. um, and so I think, if I had to give it a ranking, I'd probably say it's like 3 stars, right? Like out of 5, or a 7 out of 10, or a C on a letter scale, right? Like it very much falls into that realm for me because I think it's got a lot of cool ideas. I just think it doesn't do anything with him to some degree, or like it brings him up once and has like a really cool moment with that, and then never again. And because it's Indian, is just a little bit too emoji for me. So that would be my review of Annihilation.
That was the shrug emoji for audio listeners.
Oh yeah.
Um, yeah, I remember when that came out, like because I have a decent mix of like film Twitter in my in my mention or
Yeah.
in my
Same,
follows
yeah.
and stuff like that. So I remember seeing that and like looking at people at like places like Screen Junkies and Collider and stuff talk about it,
Mhm.
and it like the consensus being like kind of divisive in that regard of like they didn't really
Yeah,
know what to
I can
expect
see
going
that.
in. Marketing didn't really know how to market that movie, it seemed.
I can
Um,
imagine, yeah.
and without like without giving away anything or something like that. And I just remember like getting enough of a vibe from the things, just being like, yeah, I don't think that's really going to be anything up my alley. I don't need to hop into it. Shout out to Natalie Portman, like getting behind and championing these projects. Because
Yeah.
I remember like one of the elements was like it was a a very strong female cast kind of core
Mhm.
centric thing, and that was something that obviously
Yes.
especially coming off of something like Thor the Dark World and stuff where she'd had such a bad time with that, of something she was getting more and more vocal about and becoming more of a champion for. um so I'm glad she was able to help get that movie made and provide it with like the star power that it needed to get made. But yeah, it enough of like the reviews were mixed, or we're just gonna be like, I don't really know who the audience is for this movie, and so if that doesn't sound like you or whatever, it's probably not gonna be your thing. And I was like, yeah, like it was one. I don't think I'd been like I got enough of like horror suspense thriller vibes from it that I was
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
yeah,
You're definitely in the moment.
probably not going to be one that I really jump out to see. Like A Quiet Place is like the most recent one that I actually did make an effort to go see after so many people were talking it up and like celebrating it. Whereas like a movie like this that has had responses like yours, or had a handful of responses that were like,
Yeah.
I really liked it, I really get what they're doing with it. um but it was like the more general vibe I was getting were either the mixed reviews like you, or people just being not really fans of what the movie was trying to do in the first place. So I was like, okay, well, it's not one I'm not gonna like put on my brave suit and be like, yes, I'm gonna go try and sit through something like this. So
Yeah.
well,
I think that's fair.
that
Um,
is Annihilation. So
mhm.
last thing for me, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be kind of my brief little like 60-second
Mhm.
almost re-review of Hades. So I finished late last night, i.e. 4 a.m. this morning. I got the platinum in
God.
Hades, which very doable, especially if you turn on the God mode as I did. For my, but it's also like a grind, and fortunately it's a grind and like a very fun grindy game. But also my thumb is going to be very glad that I'm not going to be playing Hades much anymore. um, because like every run
Yeah.
or two, I would get to the point where I was just button mashing for some of those dungeons so much that like my thumb has been sore for a week straight, and I would have to like just kind of like massage like the joints and stuff in between every run before before starting another go. um but just get game continues to be a phenomenal game. I love I like I appreciated this element of it the first time around, but just even more so this time, in that like every single weapon in that game has the potential to be fun and powerful and like really like get the job done if you get like the right mix of boons and perks and stuff throughout a run of the game. Like of the 50 plus clears that I have now on the PlayStation version of the game, like there were very few that felt like, oh yeah, I played this the exact same way I'd played another run or something like that. It was constantly, especially because I embrace what the game kind of encourages, where like each run of that game encourages you to pick one of the weapons where you're going to get like a boost in the darkness and potentially the gems if you upgrade, that you're going to get back. So it's inviting you to play multiple ways. I've seen other people that just like they lock into weapon, that's the weapon they like, so they're going to just do every run with that weapon. And you can definitely do that, but I appreciate that like if you do want to play with a variety, that there's something to explore. And there are definitely like versions of the weapons that I don't like or that I like less than others, but overall like I could probably go through and like, cuz each of the 6 weapons has like 4 different variations of that weapon. So with each of those 24 weapons, I could probably go through and clear at least like the super low level, like no modifiers and stuff. I could probably clear through that game if I get the right like mix of builds, because the way just the boon system works on top of the weapons themselves is just like really cool, and just allows for such a wide variety of play styles that that game is just firing on all cylinders. And I love that like I can, if I need to take a break from button mashing and like punching through everything with the like the fist gauntlets, I can switch to the bow and arrow, which is going to be more ranged, like stay back out of the action and try and do things from afar. I can try that approach if I need to, when I need to switch things up. So yeah, just Hades continues to be a great game. Obviously one of my favorites from last year. Really loved hopping back into it again this year and chasing down those trophies. And I especially love that they didn't do what I've seen Supergiant do in the past of like lock some of the trophies behind like you've got to do everything with all the modifiers on. It's like the worst one.
Empire. That trophy list is rough.
Yeah, the worst one in that regard is getting, you have to get Skelly's second prize, which those get unlocked basically after you've beaten the game, and you get the Pact of Punishment, which is where you can add a modifier of like, okay, um, uh, for one flame, I believe is the, or one heat, I think. For one unit of heat, you can turn this modifier on, and it's gonna make enemies 20% faster. Or you can up that again and make them 40% faster, something like that. For one of the trophies, you have to complete a run with 16 heat on it, which you can get through a variety of different like mix and match kind of configurations. And that was probably the hardest one that I had to do, was just because I had to figure out, okay, given my play styles and my approaches to the game, which of these modifiers can I turn on that I can complete a run in with all of those other elements. Like one of the ones I usually do when I'm just kind of like going through is I'll turn on like the time limit modifier, where it's like, okay, you've got 9 minutes to get through each of the like the 4 areas of the game. And I tried doing that the first time around. I had that one on, among a whole bunch of other things, and because the enemies were tougher and there were more of them and all these other elements, I just wasn't clearing through things as quickly as I needed to. So I wasn't going to make it in the time limit that I had. So ultimately I had to like swap something else. Like I was like, I will still be able to do it this way, just not with that time limit modifier on. So I had to like figure out one other modifier to kind of like swap in for its place to get the thing. So it's still definitely a difficult platinum to get, but it's doable.
Mhm.
It is also a very grindy platinum, like because that wasn't even the last trophy I needed to do. The last one I needed was you have to max out all of your keepsakes, and each
Oh,
keepsake takes like I think like 60 encounters, so like 60 chambers to like level up to their max level. So
oh,
you just have to like play with everything and play with them like a lot. And when I was doing like my normal run of the game to get like all the other trophies and stuff, I usually like locked into like one or two other like things. I wasn't just like playing with those other boon or with those other keepsakes just to start leveling them up. So I got to the end game and it was okay. Now I'm just gonna have to grind through a whole bunch of like. I basically had to do like 10 extra runs just to like level up all the things that I still needed to level up at that point. So that was the last one I got, but did it, got the platinum, woohoo. And uh and and that will be one of my when I ultimately do my like end of the year like platinum
wrap up.
wrap up that I did the last year. That'll be one I will that it's probably going to be near the top of the list for like how rewarding that one felt, because it's a game that I love, got to put a lot of time into it, and yeah, I felt real good about that. So those are my updated Hades thoughts. As a tease, so I'm this the story that I'm telling here, the platinum I got was on the same like run of things that have been in the Trevor Plays Hades series that we've been doing as our Let's Plays the last couple weeks.
Mhm.
Um, and when all was said and done, I think those 54 clears that I got were over like the course of 70 some odd runs. So just as a heads up, I will in the very near future the Let's Play series will be wrapping up here, because I will get my first clear pretty early on in that. And I recorded that like a week and a half ago now, I guess. So yeah, it was just kind of like did that, finished recording the Let's Plays, and just kept playing that game a lot for the last week to get all the other trophies in it. So those are my Hades thoughts. So let us bring it back around to you, unless you have any questions for me or anything on Hades, Logan.
Nope.
All right. Um,
None.
so bring it back around to you. You have finally started playing
Mhm.
Jedi Fallen Order. This
That's
game came
correct.
out late 2019. So yeah,
Mhm.
what are your kind of initial thoughts? How far in are you, and what are your kind of initial things? Because one of the elements of this that you and I have talked about numerous times is that this is a Souls-like game,
Mhm.
but it is a Souls-like game with difficulty settings and elements like that that you
Mhm.
can kind of like help to alleviate some of your experience. So, yeah, how far are you? What difficulty level you playing on? All that fun stuff.
I'm on Jedi Knight difficulty.
Okay.
Um, I currently am on Bogano. I made it to the vault where I got like my first message from the guy being like, "There's a list of Jedi younglings around the
Hmm.
galaxy. You have to go to this new planet now." I literally just got to that and then I paused it
Okay.
and it's paused
So
over there.
so one of the big fights is basically immediately to come, and I'll be curious how like I'll be curious talking about the game with you now, through this part versus if I talk to you tomorrow, when we sit down and record something else, how your thoughts on the game will have changed after that first boss fight.
Sure.
But yeah, so where are you at? So
Um,
you got the vault, you've triggered that kind of
mhm.
cutscene and gotten that backstory stuff. So yeah, how you feeling about the game's opening?
I think it's great. I mean, I think it's excellent. I think part of it is just this is I think a really good full circle to the Star Wars conversation we had before the podcast started off
Hmm.
mic. Um, I just love Star Wars. I just think it's sort of that simple, right? Like I do think it's just there's just some sort of magic to that galaxy, right? And that universe. And so it's all of the small things, right? It's the musical cues, right? When like the ship is landing on Bogano, right? And it just like cues into like some classic Star Wars music, right? It's the first jump to hyperspace, right? It is, you know, almost the most primal of all feelings, right? Of like being a 5-year-old kid, right, with like a cape tied around your neck, like swinging around the stick you found in the playground that's a lightsaber in your mind, right? Like it's all these things. And like I think this is probably the best a lightsaber has ever felt in a video game. I think it does it better than Force Awakens 1 or 2 did, or like the Battlefront video games and they incorporated lightsabers. Like this game's lightsaber system, and
But
again, I'm very early on,
Force
feels really
Unleashed, do you
well.
mean? You said Force Awakens.
I said Force Awakens. Yes, Force Unleashed. Um, it's the best lightsabers ever felt, right? I think it's really clever how it does it. I think Cal's a really interesting character that I'm eager to learn more about, right? And his backstory and his master's relationship. Um, and so I think it's exciting to jump into this new Star Wars property that is, going to be a long thing I'm going to be doing, navigating the world, going to these different planets. Um, I just think there's a magic to Star Wars, and I think this game sort of gets it right in a way that, as you've just seen over the course of summer, Star Wars movies do to varying degrees. And I think one of the things I said about Rogue One is it understands the magic of the original trilogy, which is just the nucleus of all of Star Wars, obviously for obvious reasons, and like what makes those three films so special and so apart from everything else that's followed it. And Rogue One, I think, got that, and that's why I think Rogue One is probably my favorite Star Wars thing that isn't the original trilogy. And very early on, obviously, right? Knock on wood, but this game feels like it kind of gets those same dynamics of what makes that original trilogy so special. Um, and I'll be curious to see that kind of develop. I'll be curious to see the characters develop and where we'll go, what planets we'll visit. I'm excited to build out my own lightsaber over time, obviously. That's gonna be super exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And then
And
yeah, like
the
I'm
most exciting
really
bit
curious to
is
see.
sorry to cut you off, but like I remember
Oh,
when playing it originally, you'll eventually get like a whole bunch of just kind of like pieces that you can kind of customize the lightsaber and stuff, and you can basically get
I've
those
heard so
same
different.
pieces in the Star Wars land at Disneyland and stuff. So you can like
Ooh,
you can design your lightsaber at Star Wars, and you can build your lightsaber at Star Wars modified off of your design here from Jedi Fallen Order if you really wanted to.
I think the issue with that, to take that point, is that whenever I go to Star Wars Land, as it will henceforth be called in this conversation, um, I would probably just get Luke's Return of the Jedi lightsaber.
I mean, you can do that too,
I
sure.
just that great lightsaber. It's just that great. It's such an interesting thing. I constantly bounce back and forth about whether or not I would want a blue or green lightsaber. But my favorite lightsaber is Luke's green lightsaber from Return of the Jedi. But if I would have a blue or a green one, and I'm sure I've already been spoiled that you can get like a plethora of lightsaber colors in this game, not just like blue or green, obviously. So kind of having fun with that and seeing what I would want to do and what I kind of want to build. Whenever I get back to the ship now, I've collected like a bunch of different lightsaber pieces that I can like tinker around with, or not a bunch, but some.
Hmm.
So I might already start making modifications on my lightsaber and figuring out what I want.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah, I
love
mean,
that
it's
even
super
that like
impressive.
they're just cosmetic. Like they don't change how your lightsaber feels or whatever. It is just like how do you want this thing to look? And even that even
Yeah,
that it's like you're not really seeing how it looks in the throes of combat. It's more just like when you're there at that workbench, how do you want your lightsaber to look?
yeah, and I love that. Right, you are building. It's just the thing, like you're building your lightsaber, right? And it is what you know you think works best for you, right? And works best with you. Um, no, but I think Fallen Order is a really interesting Star Wars story. It does the origin story of Solo better than Solo did in terms of like this like scavenger planet and shipyard kind of thing. And then it does kind of ushering us out into this new universe really well too, right? With this promise and potential. And I think we'll have this conversation tomorrow potentially on a podcast. I think what makes Star Wars special in a lot of ways is a lot of things, and we got into that a lot in some of Star Wars in terms of like the things I thought kind of define the heart of the original trilogy. But I think one of the things I didn't say on that Rogue One episode where I kind of talked about what makes the original trilogy stand out, that I think does make it stand out, is this idea of just looking out at the stars and then being able to reach out and actually go to them. This kind of limitless potential awaiting you, right? And that's sort of how I feel right now, right? Like making that first jump to that new planet and then being like, all right, cool, and now we can just sort of go anywhere, right? We have this ability to travel the stars, right? And so I found that really exciting, right? It feels like we're at that point in A New Hope where you're Luke looking at the twin suns, and now you're being jettisoned off Tatooine. I'm excited to see where the game goes. Maybe I won't like the rest of it. I have no idea, but maybe I will. And I'm excited to see its take on Soulsborne boss fights. I'm excited to see what it does with that. In terms of the combat, I really like it. I'm actually someone who's wasn't for a long time, but has gotten pretty decently okay and good with like parry systems, except for in Souls games. But here, like in a lot of other games like Ghost, I've gotten pretty good at parry systems. And so if that is like a key element, which I feel like it will be, I'm okay with that right now. At least with the enemies I face, obviously if they're going to get harder, we'll see. Um, but yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm really eager to hop back into it. Honestly, pretty immediately. Um, and yeah, it's a very good opening that it's left for me so far. I will say is my last little note.
Yeah, I remember I mean, it's obviously been a while since I played it, but I remember I played pretty much the entirety of that game in that week I was in San Francisco in November of 2019 because I took my PS4 with me to play it because I knew I was going to be in my hotel room a lot because that was when I went and did Kind of Funny, but then also I was there like for a work conference that I was no longer like hired at that job anymore, so I kind of bailed on the work conference and instead went and saw like Cursed Child and stuff, and had a ton of time to sit down and just play video games. So much so I remember that was the TV in the hotel room didn't I couldn't connect the console to it, so I went to like a local Target and like, bought a monitor for that week, to sit and play Jedi Fallen Order there. Had a great time with it, and I think like I
Yeah.
basically went through and like got the platinum in that in like 4 days or whatever. It was crazy time, but like I definitely remember that opening being like, oh, that was a really cool introduction to this character who is like in hiding, who doesn't know the full extent of his abilities or whatever anymore, because it has been like so suppressed, um that and then just seeing, yeah, going to that first planet, going to Pagano and seeing that open up and dive into all those other elements of that game. It was a lot of fun, early game stuff. So um I don't think I played it on whatever like the easiest difficulty was, which I may have been Padawan or something. I don't remember.
Story mode, like that, yeah.
But yeah, and it's one I like. Whenever they announce an eventual sequel to it, I'll probably go back and like revisit now that it's on like PS5 and all that stuff.
I'm playing on PS5 by the way
Yeah,
as well. I should
yeah.
make that clear.
Um, and revisit that story and just kind of like, because it's like I remember enjoying the story at the time, but it's a very blurry story for me at this point. Like I would have to,
Mm.
like I remember some of the characters that you encounter along the way, but I don't remember like names, and I don't remember necessarily like the ins and outs of all the relationships and stuff. So I would definitely need like to refresh myself on that before hopping into a sequel eventually. But
Mm.
I mean, yeah, it was definitely fun combat that did some of the things that I don't like about Soulsborne games, but it was forgiving enough that I pushed past it and was able to get through it. So, yeah, I'm glad you're finally hopping in and enjoying it so far. And again, I will be
Yeah.
like, I know. Have you? Because how much exploring did you do before going to the vault on Bogano? Because there's
I did quite a bit. Yeah.
okay. Did you encounter a giant frog creature?
Yeah.
Okay, how'd you do with the giant frog creature?
I like fought it a little bit. I didn't like kill it, but like 'cause it's like strong. But like I fought a little bit and like took down like a third of its health, and then just kind of ran around and did other stuff. Then came back around it again, fought a little bit, ran around it.
Yeah,
Like I'm also learning that like I don't have to like I can just like run around shit sometimes too, and
yeah.
like that's just easier, right? Like I'm at that point in time, and like as a gamer, where like I don't just like kill it all multiple times because like I'll just keep popping back anytime you save. So it's like
Yeah.
run around once I killed it once.
Yeah. Oh, okay, because that was definitely one that I like. I remember encountering that thing and being like, okay, this is just clearly a thing I'm gonna have to like come back later and kill when I'm like more powered up
Hmm.
or something like that. And yeah, you can defeat it, early on if you
It's just like a pain
if
in the
you're
ass.
yeah if
Yeah.
you if you are really good with the parry mechanics and dodging and stuff like that. But yeah, I was like, this isn't so like it was like realizing that I didn't have to fight that guy and I could like
Hmm.
bail was one of the things that I was like, okay, cool. I'm gonna I'm gonna go against what I like what years of gaming have kind of like trained in me of
Yeah.
like kill everything, and I'm just gonna be like, no, sometimes
Hmm.
just avoid it. Just leave it alone.
Just surviving is the best option. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I look forward to hearing your continued thoughts as we
Hmm.
continue to chat about the game in the weeks to come. So, um, other than that, I think that is gonna do it for this episode of That Nerdy Site Show. Thank you, Logan, for joining me to sit down and talk about these things. Lots
Always.
of good Raya conversation there. You can
Absolutely.
follow Logan at Lefty Logie. Anything you want to give a shout out to, Logan?
I will give a shout out to the final episode of Summer of Star Wars that Trevor, Cameron, Frank, and special guest Christian all did on Empire of Dreams, and wrapping that up. I wasn't able to make it, but you will get my thoughts on the, I don't know what a 12-part series is, but a, the dozen-ology of Star Wars soon enough. And my kind of brief thoughts on Empire of Dreams. I don't feel like I'll spend too much time on that, but go check all of their thoughts out. Go listen to all of them, and go check all of the entirety of the Summer of Star Wars. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing the summer podcast we do, whether they're the series on Hamilton or the series on Summer of Star Wars or whatever we do next year. They're always a lot of fun to sit down and do. So go check out all of that. It was a lot of fun. We did 13 episodes for you to go check out at your leisure. Star Wars is good, mostly.
Yeah, I like really the building any of like that D plus around like a theme of something. Like last year when we did like Halloween, so let's pick some Halloween movies and
Mm-hmm.
do and we did like what do we do? Like we did Nightmare Before Christmas, we did Hocus Pocus, we did Halloween
Halloween
Town,
Town.
and there was I think
Mm-hmm.
one other one in there somewhere. But then like
Mom and on a Date with a Vampire. Was that during Halloween?
I think we'd already done that one. It might have been like Phantom of the Megaplex or something like it. It might have been a
Ooh,
another
that was a great movie.
Disney Channel original or something in that vein. But then again, like when we do the around the holidays when we did like a whole bunch of the Christmas themed things, it's definitely a like I'm already kind of like turning gears on what things to do for October, and like we'll do Halloween Town 2 as kind of like the the follow up and try and figure
Yeah.
out any other good Halloween themed
We got
things
like
for that
30
idea.
Treehouse of Horror to watch.
I mean, yes,
So, I
that
mean,
is very true. Yeah, we could absolutely dive into some Simpsons. Um,
there's some great Treehouse of Horrors.
yeah. So yeah, those are always fun, and it is very much like I'm sitting here. We've wrapped up our summer of Star Wars, and I'm now like, okay, what do we do? What am I doing? What are we gonna sit down and talk about on Friday? Like I already miss not having like a schedule in place for
Mhm.
what's next. So yeah, gotta figure that out. You can follow me at Trevor J Starkey. I will. I mean, I'll echo the Summer of Star Wars shout out. Of course, that was a ton of fun. Go to deep. Go check out our any of our That D Plus show stuff. But I will. I want to just shout out the YouTube in general. I mentioned this on a
Mm.
couple of our Star Wars episodes. Um, but I've gone through and like revised the youtube.com/ that nerdy site like home screen, so there's a whole bunch of new playlists on there, and it's basically trying to like, hey, these are the playlists for the things we've done series on. So there is like That D Plus show, Star Wars, and it's all the summer Star Wars episodes as well as any prior episodes we've done on other miscellaneous Star Wars stuff. So you can go find that. You can find like That D Plus show Marvel. You can find a bunch of our Let's Play series have kind of been broken out into proper categories and stuff, like our our Let's Plays of Emily's Away series, or
Mhm.
Logan and I playing It Takes Two. So you can go check out all that over at youtube.com/thatnerdysite. And yeah, you can follow all of us over at That Nerdy Site or go to thatnerdysite.com for all the latest from us. If you liked what you heard, once again, please rate, review, like, subscribe, and maybe even consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, where every patron gets early access to a monthly bonus episode of this very show. This month's early access episode is me, Cameron, and Frank talking about our 2021 Game of the Year so far conversation. That'll go live to everybody on the Tuesday after this episode goes live, which means that I need to sit down and record the September early access episode. So I think Logan and I might sit down and do something. I got a couple ideas for that possibly tomorrow. So that'll go live to everybody. That episode will go live to everybody end of September, but it'll go live to our patrons here at the end of August. So you get that if you support us at the $1 or above level on Patreon. Thank you again for joining me, Logan. Thank you, audience, for listening. As always, stay nerdy and be good to each other.